I have a famous quote from author Toni Morrison, scribbled on a Post-it note and placed where I can see it whenever I'm seated at my desk. You've all heard it before. If there is a book you want to read but hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. So I've never read a book or heard a story about a little black girl who felt safe and loved, was funny and curious, was industrious and creative, who lived in a nurturing, segregated community in a Midwestern urban center in the middle of the 20th century. So I'd like to tell you something about that little girl, her family, and her community tonight. Sharing our stories with others has been a human characteristic since drawings on cave walls. From the oral tradition of telling stories and passing them down from one generation to the next, to written narratives, to the explosion of social media today. What matters most is who tells the story to whom. What some people see as a threat, other people see as community. I was born in 1949 in a racially segregated community in the heart of downtown St. Louis. I lived there for the first 10 years of my life. My 4 older siblings lived there for their entire childhood years. My father arrived at age 14 in 1929. When he and his mother heard about a new colored high school that was built in St. Louis, Missouri, they packed up all their worldly goods and moved from Earl, Arkansas to St. Louis so that my father could be the first in his family to attend high school. Now, my mother was a different situation. She arrived in St. Louis some years later as an Alabama college student on summer break. She was visiting a cousin who was a school teacher in St. Louis, and her cousin's husband was a chauffeur for a wealthy family. So my mother met my father that summer. He lived a few blocks away on Leffingwell. And I think maybe she came back for winter break, but they soon married and had 8 children. So by the time my younger brother Furman and I came along, and we're the 2 seated in the front there, my family of 10 lived in 3 rooms on the first floor of a house that my grandmother owned. My grandmother lived on the second floor in 2 rooms, a bedroom and a kitchen, and she rented out her front room to a roomer. That's what they called boarders. To a roomer. Now, she was able to save the down payment for that house because she was a live-in domestic servant. As a matter of fact, I couldn't find my grandmother in the 1940 or the 1950 census because I'm assuming her address was her employer's address, and I don't know her employer's names. So now, it was a modest house. It was built in the 1880s. You can imagine that there was no central heating or hot water. We had to chop wood and haul coal. I said haul. And haul coal to heat the house with potbelly stoves. We boiled water constantly for washing our bodies, washing dishes, and washing clothes. And you can imagine with that many children, there were plenty of clothes to wash. We played in the streets. Those were our playgrounds. We played double dutch and hopscotch and jacks, and boys played kickball and baseball and baseball and baseball on vacant lots. One reason we played in the street was the backyard was a garden for the most part. So we grew greens and beans and tomatoes and okra and corn. So we have lots of fresh vegetables throughout the summer, and then we can vegetables for the winter. We had a small community, but we had our friends, our teachers, our schools, and we really respected our teachers. We had churches, lots of churches. There were 42 churches in Mill Creek Valley. And one of them was this beautiful church here, which is the only church of the 42 that remains. They were all destroyed. Even those beautiful houses next to that church was demolished except for that church. We had corner stores and cafes and beauty salons and barber shops and shoe shops, everything a little community needs. And on every corner or every intersection, there was either a corner store or a church or both. So I was rereading a story recently by an author his name is Evan Wood. And he was writing about Mill Creek. And he asked his readers to imagine yourself in a city or a neighborhood where you used to live. Then he went on to talk about feeling nostalgic about seeing your old schoolmates or your old church or Sunday school or where you used to play. And then he said, now imagine that neighborhood was bulldozed, completely wiped out, subsumed for an interstate highway. Well, I don't have to imagine. I remember. I remember 1959 when our community was demolished, our dreams, our hopes, our history, our culture, all gone. I remember that very, very well. Now, I was too young to understand the complexities of race. But I also didn't understand the impact it had on legislation, on policy, on social mores. I didn't understand how it impacted education, employment, even housing. In 1916, white voters voted 3-1 to bar blacks from residing in certain blocks, city blocks, except for live-in domestics like my grandmother. Just 1 year later, the Supreme Court struck down that ruling and said that zoning was unconstitutional. Restrictive zoning was unconstitutional. But not to worry, because the real estate industry came to the rescue like the cavalry. They said, don't worry about the Supreme Court. We have contracts. We have covenants. We have deeds. All we have to do is agree as white people to not sell to black people. It's that simple. It's like deciding not to have a commercial business in your block, or bringing your trash cans in by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or not painting your house purple. If we all agree, we don't have to worry. The real estate industry enforced race-restrictive covenants for the next 50 years. So let's move on. That's kind of heavy. So let's move on to 2015. So I'm driving along Jefferson Avenue, and I stop at a stoplight at the intersection of Jefferson and Market. So I'm sitting there, and I look up, and there's this surface parking lot. I don't mean a parking structure. I mean asphalt and a fence. And it's a full square city block. And I thought, that's where Cousin Brownie's house used to be. And then I looked around and I thought, there is absolutely nothing here to indicate that this was the heart of our community. Mill Creek was a tight-knit, vibrant community of Black people. It was segregated, but it was a diverse Black community. Diverse in that poor people, working poor people, and well-to-do Black people all lived in close proximity. Because of redlining and restrictive covenants, we all had to live very close together. But now, that's all simply erased. So we're still at the parking light. So I look over out of my parking passenger side window, and I see the sprawling campus of Wells Fargo Advisors, stretching for blocks in 3 directions. And I thought, 60 years ago, there was another financial institution at that very intersection, Jefferson and Market. It was called the People's Finance Corporation Building. It's set on the edge of downtown as a monument to Black achievements of the 1920s. 7 Black businessmen pooled their funds to start this corporation so that Black people could get loans that white-owned lending institutions would not provide for them. But it was more than just a bank or a mortgage company. Some of the tenants in that building would shape St. Louis for decades to come. People like attorney Homer G. Phillips. Homer G. Phillips was a young attorney who ushered through a bond issue in the 20s to get a Black modern teaching hospital for people on the Black people on the north side of St. Louis. He died very young under mysterious circumstances. But the hospital was built. They honored him by naming it for him. But the hospital was more than just a medical institution for people of the city. It was a teaching institution for more than 50 years that trained medical professionals, physicians, dentists, nurses, who practiced throughout this country. Then there was George Vaughan, who was planning with Thurgood Marshall to take the case to the Supreme Court that ended restrictive covenants. There were important newspapers and doctors and lawyers and all kinds of fraternal organizations, and it was just the hub of commercial, political, and social life for Mill Creek. So let's turn the corner. Let's get away from this light. So if we go west on Market Street, past Wells Fargo by a few blocks, you see Vivan High School. This is the very Vivan High School that lured my grandmother and my father to St. Louis. It is one of only two of the four buildings that's still standing. When it was built in 1927, it was built next to a baseball stadium for the St. Louis Stars, the world champion St. Louis Stars Negro League team. They were one of only a few teams that had a stadium. So let's get away from this tour and get to my idea to write these stories down. I was the only Black in a writing group, and my fellow writers knew nothing about Mill Creek, knew nothing about where it was and who was there. They knew that one boundary was at St. Louis University, one boundary was at Union Station, but they didn't know we were in between. So when I think about this disconnect, I think about parallel lines. I think about parallel communities, side-by-side neighborhoods that never intersect. I think that, like Market Street, people drive downtown, go to their offices, to the theater, to sporting events, and never ever look over to see what's on the other side. So I'm hoping tonight that we can decide to look over, cross over, and see what's happening on the other side and how our lives do intersect. Thank you. So I said, well, what next? Where do we go from here? I heard an interview with Sherilyn Eiffel, who is a former attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And that question was put to her, what next? She said, we have to create new expectations for where we want our society to go based on our knowledge of the past. Our knowledge of the past. Maybe that little girl's story starts over with an apology, but it certainly starts with a new imagining. Thank you.